begin today's story, we must take a moment to reflect on a painful reality that still haunts many corners of our society. The story you are about to hear is a tribute to all those who have suffered from prejudice and the weight of unfair labor. We firmly repudiate any form of modern slavery, forced labor, or the dehumanization of workers based on their social status or the color of their skin. Every human being deserves dignity, respect, and fair compensation for their effort. May this narrative serve not only as entertainment, but as a call for empathy. If you value stories that speak the truth and honor the human spirit, please subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and leave your like. Your support allows these voices to be heard. Now, let's enter the life of Helena. The weight of the silver tray in my hands was more than just physical. It was the weight of every silent year I spent in that house. To the Millers, I was a ghost that cleaned. I remember the way they would talk about their million-dollar investments or their European vacations right in front of me, as if I didn't have ears. As if my presence was no more significant than a piece of furniture. They didn't know that I had a life outside those walls. They didn't know that my husband, Ricardo, was a man of poetry and calloused hands, or that my daughter, Clara, was studying to be a doctor so she would never have to scrub a floor like I did. I remember one specific morning, very early on, when the sun was just hitting the marble foyer. Mrs. Miller looked at me, not into my eyes, but at my hands, and commented on how lucky I was to have such a stable job. I smiled politely, the way I had been trained to, but inside, a small flame of resentment flickered. Luck wasn't waking up at 4 a.m. to take 3 buses. Luck wasn't the chemical burns on my fingers from the harsh acids used to keep their bathrooms pristine. But back then, I swallowed that fire. I believed that as long as my home was safe, as long as Ricardo loved me and Clara excelled in school, the humiliation at the Miller mansion was just a price I had to pay. Ricardo was my anchor. When I would come home, smelling of bleach and exhaustion, he would be there with a cup of tea and a look of such pure adoration that for a moment the aches in my body would vanish. We were building something beautiful, or so I convinced myself. Our house was small, but it was filled with books and the scent of home-cooked meals. We lived in a delicate balance. I was the bridge between 2 worlds, the world of excess and the world of survival. I never told Ricardo the full extent of the things I heard or the way I was treated. I wanted to protect him. I wanted our home to remain untainted by the coldness of the world outside. I thought that by being the perfect maid, I could buy the perfect life for us. I didn't realize that perfection is often the thinnest of veils, hiding a darkness that was already beginning to seep through the cracks of our foundation. Every polished spoon, every iron sheet was a testament to my love, but also a break in the wall I was inadvertently building between me and the truth. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in a house of that size. It's not the peaceful silence of a sleeping baby. It's a heavy, expectant silence, as if the walls themselves are waiting for you to fail. I learned to move within that silence like a ghost. I knew which floorboards in the east wing creaked and which doors needed a gentle lift to close without a sound. My life was measured in cycles of grime and restoration. On Mondays, it was the heavy drapes that seemed to trap the dust of decades. On Tuesdays, the chandeliers, each crystal droplet requiring a steady hand and a prayer that my trembling fingers wouldn't let one slip. If a single glass shattered, it would cost more than my monthly rent. And the Millers never let me forget the value of the things I touched. I remember watching Mrs. Miller's hands. They were soft, pale, and untouched by time. She spent her afternoons at charity luncheons, discussing poverty over plates of lobster, while I knelt in the laundry room, fighting stains out of silk shirts that cost more than my daughter's entire school tuition. The irony was a bitter pill I swallowed every single day. But when the bitterness became too much, I would reach into the pocket of my apron and touch the small, folded photograph of Clara. She was 10 years old in that photo, wearing a bright yellow ribbon in her hair. That ribbon was my North Star. It reminded me that I wasn't just a maid. I was a soldier on a battlefield, fighting for her future. Ricardo never understood the full depth of the invisibility I felt. To him, I was the sun. When I walked through our front door at 8 p.m., he would take my heavy bag and lead me to the kitchen chair. He'd soak my feet in warm water, with sea salt a luxury he insisted on, even when money was tight. Helena, he would whisper, "Your feet carry the weight of our world. Let me carry you for a while." In those moments, I felt like a human being again. I would tell him about the flowers in the Miller's garden, or the beautiful paintings on their walls, omitting the way Mr. Miller would look right through me when I served his coffee, or how the youngest son would track mud across a floor I had just spent 3 hours polishing, without a single word of apology. I curated my life for Ricardo. I gave him the beauty and kept the thorns for myself. I thought this was love. I thought that by absorbing the humiliation, I was keeping it from poisoning our small, sacred space. I didn't realize that by keeping those secrets, I was creating a vacuum, and nature and truth abhor a vacuum. The perfection I was so carefully maintaining was a glass house, and the first stone was already being lifted by hands I hadn't yet seen. Entendido, diretor. Vamos entrar agora no bloco tu. O foco aqui a chegar emotional de Helena. Ela está tão focada no objetivo final, o futuro da filha, que ela normaliza o absurdo. Vamos trabalhar o preconceito de forma velada, através de gestos. Tons de voz e pequenas exigências que, somadas, revelam uma mentalidade colonial e desumana por parte dos patrões. Bloco to pequeno sine de distancia, small signs of distance English version. The cracks in a foundation don't always scream, sometimes. They whisper so softly that you mistake them for the wind. For years, I convinced myself that the way the Millers treated me was simply the order of things. I had internalized my own invisibility so deeply that I didn't even recognize when their requests crossed the line. From employment to a quiet, modern form of servitude. I remember the day Mrs. Miller decided that the back staircase, the one I used to carry heavy crates of laundry, was too loud. She didn't suggest a rug. Instead, she asked if I could remove my shoes and work in my stockings so my heavy footsteps wouldn't disturb her afternoon naps. I didn't see the insult then. I only saw a way to keep my job, even as the cold marble floor seeped into my bones, chilling me from the feet up. There was a subtle, unspoken boundary that I was never allowed to cross. It was in the way, mister. Miller would hand me his keys, never touching my palm, as if my skin carried a stain that even his expensive soaps couldn't wash away. Or the way they spoke about people like me during their dinner parties, discussing the work ethic of the lower classes while I stood 3 feet away, pouring their vintage wine. They spoke as if I were a statue, a piece of living machinery that didn't have a history, a family, or a soul. I remember a particular afternoon when a guest asked where I was from. Before I could even open my mouth, Mrs. Miller chuckled and said, "Oh, she's just been part of the house forever, haven't you, Helena? She's like the Foundation's reliable and silent." She didn't mention my country, my name, or my daughter. I was just an extension of the brick and mortar. The most painful signs, however, were the ones I ignored at home. Ricardo started to look at me with a sadness I couldn't interpret. He saw the way I began to hunch my shoulders, a physical manifestation of the yes, ma'am I said 100 times a day. He noticed when I started bringing home the Miller's discarded leftovers, and I'd present them like a feast. "Look, Ricardo, they didn't even touch the pheasant," I'd say with a forced smile. He would look at the silver-foiled container, and then at me, his eyes dark with a dignity I was slowly losing. "We don't need their scraps, Helena," he would say, his voice thick with a pride I had traded for security. But I was blind. I told him he was being too sensitive. I told him that as long as the money was being deposited into Clara's college fund, nothing else mattered. I didn't realize that by accepting the role of the submissive shadow at the mansion, I was bringing that shadow home, letting it cast along. Cold darkness over the man who only wanted me to stand tall. I was so busy polishing someone else's life that I didn't notice the tarnish spreading over my own. After that night in the master's suite, I began to develop a sort of spiritual callus. Just as my hands had hardened to handle the boiling water and the caustic soaps, my soul began to build a layer of protection. I retreated into a deep, silent denial. To survive, I had to believe that my suffering had a divine purpose. I started carrying a small wooden rosary in my apron pocket, right next to the photo of Clara. Every time Mr. Miller spoke to me as if I were a ghost. Every time Mrs. Miller looked at my bare feet with that clinical indifference, I would reach into my pocket and rub those beads until my thumb was raw. I told myself that God was watching. I told myself that I was like the martyrs I read about in church, that my humiliation in this life was the gold that would pave Clara's path in the next. This faith became my drug. It allowed me to smile when I felt like screaming. I remember one Sunday, I was so exhausted I could barely stand during the Mass. Ricardo held my arm, his face etched with a worry that was starting to turn into resentment. "Helena, look at yourself," he whispered as we walked home. "You're fading away." You're not a wife anymore. You're a ghost of the Millers. Is this what God wants? For you to be a slave to people who don't even know your last name? I snapped at him then. It was the first time I raised my voice in our sacred home. I told him he didn't understand sacrifice. I told him that my disappearance was the only reason our daughter was sitting in a classroom instead of a kitchen. I chose to see his love as a lack of ambition. I chose to believe that his desire to protect my dignity was actually a threat to Clara's future. I began to deny reality to the point of madness. I would stay extra hours at the mansion without pay, telling myself I was sowing seeds of favor. I would wash the same floor twice if I saw a shadow of a footprint, convinced that if I reached a state of perfect service, the universe would somehow reward Clara tenfold. I was living in a trance of martyrdom. I stopped telling Ricardo about the insults. I stopped telling him about the mute servant comments. I locked it all in a dark basement inside my heart. I thought I was being strong. I thought I was being a saint. But in reality, I was just making it easier for the Millers to erase me. I was so busy looking at the heavens, waiting for a reward for my pain, that I didn't see the ground beneath my own family crumbling. I was sacrificing the present on the altar of a future that I was beginning to realize might never belong to me. The spiritual intoxication I felt was the only thing that kept me moving when my muscles screamed for rest. I remember one afternoon in the Millers' private chapel, a cold, gold-leafed room they used more for show than for prayer. I was cleaning the crucifix, a heavy silver piece, and I found myself talking to it. You understand, don't you? I whispered to the silent metal. You know what it's like to be broken for the sake of others. I felt a twisted sense of pride in my pain. I began to see my swollen ankles as medals of honor and the stinging of the cleaning chemicals as a baptism. I was convinced that the more I suffered in silence, the more pure my contribution to Clara's life became. I was trading my humanity for her opportunity, and I believe the exchange was sanctified. But this sanctity was driving a wedge between me and Ricardo. One night, I came home so late that the buses had stopped running, and I had walked the last 3 miles. My feet were bleeding through my thin stockings, the ones Mrs. Miller made me wear. Ricardo was waiting at the kitchen table, the light from a single bulb casting harsh shadows over his face. He didn't say a word as he brought the basin of water. But when he saw the blood, he dropped to his knees and let out a sound that was half sob, half growl. "Helena, stop this," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "This isn't faith. This is slow suicide. They are eating you alive, piece by piece, and you're letting them because you think you're a saint. But Clara doesn't need a saint. She needs a mother. I need my wife." I pulled my feet away from him, feeling a surge of irrational anger. How dare he question my sacrifice? How dare he make me feel small for doing what had to be done? You have the luxury of pride, Ricardo, because I have the burden of reality, I hissed. I looked at our modest kitchen, at the peeling wallpaper and the cracked linoleum, and for a moment I hated it. I hated our life because it wasn't the life of the Millers. My denial had reached a point where I started to resent the very people I was sacrificing myself for, simply because they weren't enough to make the pain stop. I went to bed without eating, clutching my rosary so hard that the beads left imprints on my palm. I fell asleep praying for more strength to endure more humiliation, never realizing that I was praying for my own disappearance. I was becoming the very mute servant Mr. Miller wanted, and I was doing it in the name of God. The world doesn't end with a thunderclap. It ends with a quiet sound, like the rustle of paper or the click of a door being opened when it should have remained shut. My awakening happened on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of day where the sky over the Miller estate looked like bruised skin. I was cleaning the master library, a place filled with books no one ever read, when I saw a folder that had fallen behind Mr. Miller's heavy mahogany desk. As I reached for it, my fingers trembling from the damp cold, the contents spilled out. It wasn't just business contracts. There were photos. Photos of my husband, Ricardo. My heart didn't just beat. It hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. In the photos, Ricardo wasn't at the warehouse where he claimed to be working overtime. He was at a construction site, one of the Miller's many luxury developments. But he wasn't just a worker. He was being handed an envelope by Mr. Miller's driver. My breath hitched. I found a payroll ledger tucked inside the same folder. There, among the names of high-level contractors, was Ricardo's name. He wasn't just working for them. He was being paid 5 times what I was as a security consultant for their private projects. But the real shock, the one that made the room spin until I had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from fainting, was a letter attached to the photos. It was a formal agreement signed by Ricardo, promising to keep me compliant and quiet in exchange for the full payment of Clara's medical school tuition. My husband, the man who washed my feet, the man who cried over my wounds, had made a deal with the devil. He wasn't trying to save me from the Millers. He was managing me for them. He was the one who encouraged me to stay when I wanted to quit years ago, whispering about sacrifice and the future, while he collected a secret salary to ensure the Miller household had its perfect, silent ghost. I wasn't a martyr for my family. I was a commodity sold by my husband to the people who considered me a piece of furniture. The mute servant wasn't just a role I played at work. It was a cage my own husband had helped build. I didn't scream when I got home. I didn't throw plates or weep. There is a stage of grief that goes beyond tears, a frozen tundra where the soul turns to ice. I sat at our small kitchen table, the same table where he had soaked my feet, the same table where he had lied to me every single night for years. I placed the folder and the photos right in the center, under the dim light of the single bulb. When Ricardo walked in, smelling of rain and deceit, he didn't see me at first. He started his usual routine, reaching for my bag, his voice soft with that rehearsed pity. "Hard day, my love. Let me get the warm water. How much did they pay you to watch me bleed, Ricardo?" My voice was a whisper, but it cut through the room like a razor dot. He froze. His eyes fell on the table, and I watched the color drain from his face, leaving him looking as gray and empty as the ashes in a fireplace. He tried to speak, his lips trembling, but I didn't let him. I thought you were my sanctuary. I thought when I came home with chemical burns on my hands and the weight of their insults on my back, I was coming back to a man who saw my soul. But you didn't see me, did you? You saw a paycheck. You saw a way to buy Clara's future with my skin. He fell to his knees, not out of adoration this time, but out of the crushing weight of his own guilt. Helena, listen to me. It was for Clara. They offered to pay for everything. I couldn't say no. I saw you suffering, and I thought, if we're going to suffer, let it be for a reason. I didn't want you to know, because I knew your pride wouldn't let you stay. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor, a sound of pure agony. My pride? You mean my dignity? You sold the one thing I had left. You turned our marriage into a management contract. You told them you'd keep me compliant. You became my overseer, Ricardo. You were the one holding the invisible whip while you pretended to wash my feet. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at the man I had loved for half my life and saw a stranger. He wasn't my anchor. He was the anchor tied around my neck, keeping me submerged in the miller's world so he could feel like a provider. The betrayal wasn't just in the money, it was in the fact that he watched me disappear and cheered for the process. Ricardo reached out to touch my hand, a habit of 20 years, but I flinched as if his skin were made of fire. Don't, I spat, the word tasting like bile. Every time you rubbed my feet, were you counting the coins they gave you? Every time you told me to endure just one more year, were you thinking about the bonus you'd get for my silence? You weren't comforting me, Ricardo. You were maintenance. You were making sure the machine didn't break down before the job was done. He started to sob, a pathetic, broken sound that once would have shattered my heart, but now it only made me feel a cold, detached disgust. I did it so she could have a life, Helena. A life like theirs, so she wouldn't have to be invisible. I thought if one of us stayed in the shadows, the other could walk in the sun. I love you. I've always loved you. Love doesn't collaborate with the oppressor. I shouted, the volume of my voice startling even myself. For 20 years, I had whispered in the Miller house, and now the roar of a decades-old injustice was tearing out of my throat. You didn't want her to be invisible, but you were perfectly fine with me disappearing. You sat across from me, eating the food I bought with my humiliation, and you never once had the courage to tell me that my husband was on the payroll of the man who calls me a mute servant. Did you laugh with him, Ricardo? Did you share a drink while discussing how to keep me working? Did you tell him I was easy to handle as long as I had my rosary and my photos of Clara? I looked at the rosary on the table, the wooden beads I had prayed over, with such desperation. I picked it up and threw it at him. It didn't hurt him physically, but it hit the floor with a hollow sound that signaled the end of my faith in him. You used my God and my daughter against me. You turned my sacrifice into a business deal. I wasn't just a maid for the Millers, Ricardo. I was a maid for you, too. You cleaned your conscience with my labor. He stayed there, on the floor, a broken man in a kitchen that no longer felt like home. I realized then that the walls I had spent my life cleaning weren't just in the Miller mansion. I had been living inside a prison of his making, decorated with the lies of a perfect marriage. Entendido, dieter, no bloco 6. Vamos trabalhar a vulnerabilidade absoluta de Helena. Ela perdu o chao, olar ia fei no marido. O encontro como advogado será o ponto de transição da vítima para justiceira, transformando sua dor em uma causa legal fundamentada na dignidade humana. Block 6, The Aftermath, Bloco 6. O Rescaldo English version. I walked out of that apartment with nothing but the clothes on my back and the weight of a shattered life. The rain had turned into a cold, persistent drizzle that blurred the city lights. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to be away from the smell of that kitchen and the sound of Ricardo's excuses. I found myself in a small, deserted park, sitting on a damp wooden bench under the yellow glow of a flickering street lamp. For the first time in 27 years, I didn't have a floor to polish or a bed to make. I was just Helena, a woman who had worked herself into a shadow for people who bought her soul from the man she loved. I sat there for hours, my hands those famous, tireless hands resting lifelessly on my lap. I looked at my bare feet, still sore from the miller's marble, and I felt a sob rise from the very depths of my being. It wasn't just sadness, it was the realization that I had participated in my own erasure. It's a cold night to be sitting alone, with such heavy thoughts, a voice said. I looked up, startled. A man stood there, holding a black umbrella. He looked tired, his coat slightly worn at the edges, carrying a briefcase that seemed to weigh more than he did. He wasn't a ghost from the Miller world. He had the look of someone who fought in the trenches of the real one. His name was Dr. Reese, a legal aid lawyer who had just finished a late shift at the courthouse nearby. I don't know why, but the dam finally broke. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the way he looked at me not as a fixture, but as a person. I started to talk. I told him about the bleach and the lavender. I told him about the mute servant lesson and the shoes I was forbidden to wear. I told him about the secret contracts and how my husband had become my overseer. As I spoke, I watched his face change. The weariness in his eyes turned into a sharp, focused fire. He didn't just listen, he started taking notes on a small pad. When I finished, the silence of the park felt different. Helena, he said, his voice low and steady, what you're describing isn't just a bad job or a toxic marriage. It's a systemic violation of your fundamental rights. They didn't just employ you, they tried to own you. The psychological manipulation, the forced silence, the secret agreements to keep you compliant. In the eyes of the law, this borders on modern-day servitude and racial discrimination disguised as domestic work. He looked me directly in the eyes, and for the first time in decades, I felt seen. I've spent my life fighting for people the world tries to forget. If you're willing to stand up, I'm willing to fight this with you. We won't just sue for wages. We will sue for the dignity they tried to strip away from you. In that moment, sitting in the cold rain, a new kind of fire started to warm my blood. The mute servant was starting to find her voice. Doctor. Reese sat down on the edge of the bench, leaving a respectful distance, but his presence felt like a shield against the wind. He didn't look at me with the fake charity pity of Mrs. Miller. He looked at me with the clinical, burning indignation of a man who spent his life studying the architecture of injustice. I told him about the hours, the lack of breaks, and the psychological games. I told him how they made me feel, that my very existence was a favor they were granting me. Helena, he said, tapping his pen against his chin, what they did to you has a name. It's called debt bondage mixed with racial profiling. By creating a situation where your daughter's future, her education, her life was tied to your absolute submission, they removed your ability to give free consent to work. They turned your motherhood into a weapon against you. And your husband. The fact that he was receiving a side payment to ensure your compliance makes this a conspiracy to exploit. It's a modern form of human trafficking within a domestic setting. I felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold. Hearing those words, bondage, conspiracy, trafficking, made the invisible chains I had carried for 27 years suddenly visible. It was as if you were turning on a light in a room where I had been stumbling in the dark for decades. I told him about the mute servant story, Mr. Miller told me. Doctor. Reese clenched his jaw so hard I could hear his teeth grind. That wasn't a history lesson, Helena. That was a psychological branding. He was telling you that you weren't a worker protected by the laws of this century. He was claiming ownership of your silence. In this state, demanding a domestic worker remain barefoot or silent under threat or coercion is a violation of dignity that carries heavy legal penalties. They think they are above the law because they are the Millers. They think you are a ghost because you've been silent. But ghosts can be very loud when they finally decide to speak in a courtroom. He handed me a card, but then he did something more important. He handed me his scarf. It was warm and smelled of old books and coffee. Go to a hotel tonight. Don't go back to that house, not the mansion, and not the apartment with that man. Tomorrow, we start the process of reclaiming Helena. We will document every hour, every insult, and every cent that was paid behind your back. They wanted a mute servant, but what they're going to get is a reckoning. As I watched him walk away into the fog, I realized I wasn't just tired anymore. I was dangerous. For the first time, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt like the storm that was about to break over the Millers' perfect, white picket fence world. The courtroom was white and sterile, a sharp contrast to the warm, suffocating wood of the Miller Library. For the first time in nearly 30 years, I was not standing in the corner. I was sitting at the front, and the Millers were the ones who had to remain silent. When Dr. Reese presented the secret contracts and the payroll logs showing Ricardo's compliance bonuses, the silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't the silence of a mute servant anymore. It was the silence of a truth so heavy it crushed the air out of the room. Miller didn't look at me once. He couldn't. Without his mahogany desk and his crystal carafe, he looked small, just an aging man who had mistaken wealth for ownership. We won the case. The settlement was substantial, enough to ensure that Clara would never have to owe them a single cent for her education. But the real victory happened outside the courtroom. I remember walking down those marble steps, my feet finally in sturdy, comfortable shoes. Ricardo was waiting at the bottom. He looked like a shadow of the man I had loved. He tried to speak, his eyes searching mine for the old devotion, but he found only a calm, distant peace. "Helena, please," he whispered. "I've lost everything. I did it for us." I looked at him and realized that I didn't hate him anymore. Hate is a heavy emotion, and I had carried enough weight for one lifetime. "No, Ricardo," I said, my voice steady and clear. "You did it for yourself, so you wouldn't have to see my pain as your failure. You traded my soul for your comfort. There is no us in a deal where one person is the product." I walked past him, and for the first time, I didn't look back to see if he was following. Clara is a doctor now. She knows the whole story. We had many long, painful nights of tears and truth. She wanted to quit school, to give the money back, but I told her that would be the final victory for the Millers. "Use it," I told her. "Use it to be the kind of doctor who sees the people others ignore. Use it to be the voice for those who are forced to be mute." I live in a small house now, far from the city. It's quiet, but it's a different kind of quiet. I spend my mornings in my garden, my hands in the soil instead of bleach. Sometimes, when I smell lavender, I feel a ghost of a shiver, but then I look at my hands scarred, worn, but finally mine. I am no longer a fixture. I am no longer a shadow. I am Helena, and I have learned that the most beautiful sound in the world isn't the chime of a silver bell or the silence of a perfect house. It is the sound of my own voice, speaking the truth in the light of day. The most difficult part of healing wasn't the legal battle or the separation from Ricardo. It was learning how to be a mother without being a martyr. For so many years, I had defined my love for Clara through my suffering. I thought that the more I allowed myself to be erased, the more space I was creating for her to exist. It took me a long time to realize that by accepting the role of the mute servant, I was teaching my daughter that a woman's dignity is negotiable if the price is right. We spent months in a quiet, heavy dialogue. Clara would sit across from me, looking at my hands, and I could see the guilt in her eyes. The burden of knowing her career was paved with the skin of my palms. I had to teach her that she wasn't responsible for the choices the men in our lives made. I had to show her that my survival was now my own, and so was my freedom. I remember the day she graduated. She stood on that stage, the first doctor in our family line, a woman of color standing tall in a world that used to only let us in through the back door with our shoes off. When she looked into the crowd and found me, she didn't just smile, she touched her throat, a silent signal that she was speaking for both of us now. At that moment, the weight of the Miller mansion finally evaporated. The silver trays, the bleach, the cold marble, it all became just a distant, muffled echo. I realized then that while they tried to turn me into furniture, I had been a seed. They tried to bury me in the dark, silent corners of their house, not knowing that I was growing, even in the shadows. Today, I sit on my porch and watch the sun go down. I don't jump when a bell rings. I don't lower my gaze when someone speaks to me. I've started writing my memories in a notebook not for a court, but for myself. Each word is a brick in a house that belongs truly to me. Ricardo still sends letters filled with a hollow regret that I no longer have the desire to read. I don't wish him ill, but I don't owe him my audience anymore. He chose his side when he took the miller's money to manage my silence. Now he has to live with the silence he so carefully cultivated. As for me, I am learning the language of rest. I am learning that my hands, once used to polish the lives of others, are now perfect just for holding a cup of tea, a book, or my daughter's hand. The mute servant is dead. Helena is finally, deeply, and loudly alive. The final judgment didn't just break the miller's pride, it shattered their empire, Doctor. Reese hadn't just sued for unpaid wages. He had exposed a system of modern-day slavery that forced the court to act with unprecedented severity. When the gavel finally fell, the judge announced a figure that sent a shockwave through the room. The Miller family was ordered to pay $100 million in punitive damages and compensation. It was a staggering, historic amount. In that moment, the courtroom felt like it was shifting on its axis. $100 million. It was the price of 27 years of silence, the price of my dignity, and the price of the secret contracts they used to buy my soul from a man who should have protected me. I watched Mr. Miller's face go from arrogant indifference to a pale, ghostly hollow. For the first time, he didn't look like a master. He looked like a man who had just realized that the invisible woman in his kitchen had cost him his legacy. But for me, the money wasn't about luxury. It was about the fact that no one in my family would ever have to scrub a floor on their knees again out of desperation. I used that fortune to build a bridge for others, founding a center for women who, like me, are treated as fixtures instead of human beings. I kept enough to live in peace, in a house where I am the only one who holds the keys. I am Helena. I am no longer a mute servant. I am a woman who turned her silence into a $100 million roar. The story of Helena is a fictional reflection of a reality that, unfortunately, still exists in the shadows of our society. Human dignity is not for sale, and no amount of money can truly pay for the loss of freedom or the weight of humiliation. We firmly repudiate all forms of forced labor and modern slavery, which often hide behind domestic walls or under the guise of opportunity. It is our collective duty to combat every type of prejudice, be it racial, social, or economic. If you or someone you know is in a situation of exploitation, where freedom is restricted or dignity is violated, do not remain silent. Silence is the weapon of the oppressor. Denounce it. Seek help. Together, we can ensure that no human being is ever treated as a mute servant again. Respect is a right, not a privilege.